Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we have a story of great rejoicing and celebration as the ark of the Lord is traveling from the house of Obed-Edom and going into the city of David. And there's a lot of rejoicing and singing and dancing going on as it enters in, particularly by David himself. He's dancing, he's got the linen ephod on, he's just rejoicing and celebrating before the Lord. Well, Michal, his wife, through Saul, remember Saul, she was Saul's daughter. It says that she looked out the window and saw what was going on, and she despised David in her heart. And then later on, when she gets to talk to him privately, she says, well, let me just read it. This is in chapter 6 in verse 20. Where she says, how the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself. And I really love David's response here, where he says, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before the Lord. I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes, but with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished. And it goes on to say that Michal ends up not having children for the rest of her life. And it must be in connection to this story. And so what this does for us is this lays down some principles for us when it comes to worship and the way that we view others and the way that they worship. Because I think this might be something that goes on maybe more than we even realize, because it typically is something that goes on in our hearts, and we may not necessarily be as verbal as Michal about it, so it goes a little bit unknown. But this idea of judging others in the way that they worship, this is something that we can all be susceptible to. It could be that we look at others in the way that they worship, and we see maybe them expressing themselves a little bit more than what we're comfortable with. Maybe they show more emotions than we're comfortable with. And when they're worshiping the Lord, it's just them and the Lord, and they just let it all go, and that makes us uncomfortable. Maybe even makes us judge them a little bit. If so, we have the same attitude as Michal here. Because that's what David was doing. He was worshiping. It was just him and the Lord. He was celebrating what the Lord had done. He didn't care what he looked like. He didn't care if he looked like a fool or not. He just wanted to worship God. And Michal despised him. And so it can be that we can fall into that trap. I might think, well, they're just showing off, or they're just trying to appear spiritual to everybody else. Or whatever, and we might despise them in our hearts. Well, we got to be very careful that we don't do that. God placed a pretty harsh discipline on Michal because of it. She was not able to bear children until the day of her death. So God's showing that he feels very strongly against people who judge others, who are worshiping the Lord with all their heart. Well, we have to be sensitive towards that. But it can go the other way as well. Sometimes we might judge the way other people's worship because we don't feel like they're expressing enough emotion. They're too stoic in the way that they worship God. And we say, well, you know what, they need to get more lively. They need to look more emotional. And we just assume that it's coming from a dry heart, an empty heart, and there's no zeal or love for the Lord, when the opposite might be true. It might be that on the inside they're just beaming and bubbling with love for the Lord. They just aren't expressing it on the outside. Some of that might be cultural. Some of that might be just coming from a different generation. It might be traditions. There might be a lot of reasons why a person might refrain from showing their emotions on the outside. And it may not be at all the fact that they don't have love or zeal for the Lord, or that they're not actually worshiping on the inside. So we don't want to be judgmental on that side either. So if you remember, Romans chapter 14 and verse 12 said that each of us will give an account of himself before God. And what that means when you apply that to worship is that each of us is going to be held accountable, or each of us are responsible, let me put it that way, Each of us are responsible by the way that we worship ourselves. And so we need to make sure our hearts are right and that we are worshiping the Lord from our hearts with the right attitude, with the right amount of passion and love and zeal for the Lord. And let the other people worry about making sure that they are worshiping the Lord in the right way. When we constantly have our eyes on what everybody else is doing, we lose sight of what we're doing, and we lose focus from the Lord, or focus on the Lord. We lose focusing on the Lord. And so that's one lesson that comes from this story. You know, let's quit being so judgmental about others in the way that they worship God. We'll leave that at that. All right, so the other thing that we can draw from this lesson is the great example that we have of David. I really like this statement that he makes to Michael in regards to this, where he says, I will be more likely esteemed. In other words, I'll look more like a fool. He says, I will be more likely esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. In other words, he was saying, I don't care. I don't care if I look like a fool. I'll be even more like a fool. The Lord has been good to me. The Lord has done great things for me, and I'm going to celebrate that. I'm going to celebrate before the Lord. And I think this is an attitude that we need more and more in our spiritual lives. Because let's face it, not only when it comes to worship, but in all areas of our lives, there are times in which we have to look like a fool to others to be pleasing to the Lord. The gospel message itself was foolish to a lot of people. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talked about how Christ crucified was foolishness to the Gentiles. To speak about a king being crucified and dying on a cross, you know, and that's how he heads up his kingdom, to the Gentiles who sought after wisdom and philosophy and all that, they seemed like that seemed like foolishness to them. That wasn't like any of the gods that they knew about. And so to accept the gospel, you might appear to be a fool, and that's true today, even in our society. Our society prides itself in reason and intellectualism. We're even transitioning now more into tolerance, to where there is no right or wrong at all. But in either case, they look at the Christians as, well, not so smart. You know, they criticize our viewpoints, they criticize our worldview, and look down on us. And when really in reality, you know, the arguments and the evidences that we have for what we believe far outweigh what they have, but they don't recognize that, and they just look down at the Christian faith. And so just believing what we believe, sometimes we have to look like a fool. But even in the things that we do sometimes, when someone does criticize us or slap us on the cheek and we turn the other cheek, to the world, that seems like foolishness. The world's like, hey, if someone does something against you, you go right back and attack back. They have no concept of Romans chapter 12, where it says, do not repay evil for evil. Overcome evil with good. That's foreign to them, and not to act in the way that they would expect you could be viewed as foolish to them. And there's a lot of different examples. There's just times that we look like a fool to others, and we should be ready to do that. You say, you know what, I'll look like a fool. I'll even look more like a fool if it brings glory and honor to the Lord. It doesn't matter how I look to others, how they might criticize me, how they might judge me. The only thing that matters is what the Lord thinks about me. If He is pleased with me, then I'm doing okay. And that should be really our attitude. So these are just some thoughts to think about. Hopefully they're helpful to you. I do appreciate you guys taking the time to watch the video. Don't forget to do your reading today. I hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. God bless.